Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and this video is part of a series of videos on Proclus's Elements of Theology. In today's video, I'm going to focus on propositions 87 through 92. Throughout this series, I've been using the E.R. Dodds translation. So for those of you who don't have the paper copy, there is a link in the description box that will lead you to a PDF version of the text. So we can see here that we're now starting a section that Dodds titled Of Being, Limit, and Infinitude. So let's jump into it. We're starting with proposition 87. All that is eternal has being, but not all that has being is eternal. So we're setting up the ranking of wholes in the intelligible realm. And here's how he does it. For participation of being is in some sense predicable even of things having temporal origin, inasmuch as they are distinct from the non-existent. And if the thing of process is not non-existent, it in some sense is. Okay, what is he saying here? So we've been making a distinction throughout these propositions between being and becoming, or the eternal and the temporal. He is saying here that even things that are in process, in coming to be or becoming, must participate being in some way. Otherwise, they would be non-existent rather than in the process of coming to be. But, he goes on to say, eternity is in no sense a predicate of things originated, and least of all is it a predicate of such as do not participate even temporal perpetuity. So here he's saying that things that have temporal origin do not participate in eternity. They participate in being, but not in eternity. On the other hand, he goes on to say, all that is eternal perpetually is, for it participates eternity, which bestows perpetuity of being upon its participants. Thus, being is participated by a greater number of terms than eternity. Therefore, being is beyond eternity, for what shares in eternity shares also in being, but not all that shares in being shares also in eternity. So this is a line of reasoning that we have already seen a few times. Proposition 60, which is cited here, states that the cause of a greater number of effects is superior. Let's take a look at that. So this one reads, whatever principle is the cause of a greater number of effects is superior to that which has a power limited to fewer objects, and which gives rise to parts of those existences constituted by the other as wholes. So the cause of a greater number of effects is superior to causes of fewer numbers of effects. Eternal things all participate being, because they exist in some way. In fact, they exist eternally. However, not everything that exists in some way participates eternity. So being, then, is the cause of a greater number of effects. It is metaphysically higher than eternity. Proposition 88 states, there is true being both prior to and in eternity, and there is also true being which participates eternity. So there is a triad being set up here, prior to eternity, in eternity, and participating eternity. This proposition is reminiscent of Proposition 65, which introduced some important language to metaphysics. 65 read, all that subsists in any fashion has its being either in its cause as an originative potency, or as a substantial predicate, or by participation, after the manner of an image. And to represent this, I gave you this triad. And you can see in green there, you can see what is pre-existent in the cause, what's in its own station and what is in the product by participation. And that language in particular, which comes out of Proposition 65, is useful for us now. Because what we're talking about is being that is prior to eternity, so eternity is pre-existent in the cause, or being that is in eternity. Eternity is in its own station. The third option here is that being is being which participates eternity. So eternity is in the product by participation. That's what we're looking at in this proposition. Okay, so let's read through this one together. For that true being exists prior to eternity has already been shown. That was Proposition 87. But it exists also in eternity, for eternity has perpetuity combined with being. So, in other words, eternity always is. And as a participant of eternity, for all that is eternal is so called because it participates both perpetuity and being. So there you have a definition of the eternal. It's that which participates both perpetuity or eternity and being. And now he's going to summarize the triad that he has just described. He says, this last grade has both its characters by participation. That's the eternal. The eternal has both of its characters by participation, perpetuity and being. Eternity has perpetuity primitively and being by participation, while being itself is primitively being. So let's take that last sentence and diagram it out. So first we see that the eternal, the last grade that he had described was the eternal, it has both of its characters by participation, perpetuity and being. So I just pulled that same language out here, but of course he's talking about eternity. It participates in eternity and it participates in being. And then eternity is that which has perpetuity primitively, being by participation. And then at the hyparxis, or at the top of this triangle, we have being itself, which is primitively being, which means that eternity is in it causally. It pre-exists, is the language that we saw in Proposition 65. Okay, so this is Proposition 88. Okay, so here in Proposition 88, he's giving us being and eternity and showing us how they would line up, if you will, in that triad. He hasn't given us the third term of the triad. He's not given us a name for it, except that it is the eternal. Okay, Proposition 89. All true being is composed of limit and infinite. So now Proclus is ready to introduce these two terms. But before we read the proposition itself, we're going to have to do a little bit of review. We want to keep in mind Proposition 84, which states that all that perpetually is infinite in potency. We also want to remember Proposition 86. This is the one I ended my last video with. Here we saw that being, because of its proximity to the one, must be unified. It therefore is not infinite in number or in size. Instead, it is infinite in power or potency. And to make this case, Proclus had cited both Propositions 61 and 62. Together, these two propositions show that unity is commensurate with power. And we're going to see that this point is relevant to today's discussion. So keep these two in mind. We'll keep also 61 and 62 in mind, that unity is commensurate with power, but also Proposition 84, all that perpetually is infinite in potency. And then Proposition 86, showing that being is infinite in potency. So we have a lot to keep in mind there, but fortunately for us, this one is short. Okay, all true being is composed of limit and infinite. For if it have infinite potency, as we saw in Proposition 86, then it is manifestly infinite, and in this way it has the infinite as an element. And if it be indivisible and unitary, in this way it shares in limit. And we can conclude that it is indivisible and unitary because, remember, unity is commensurate with power. Okay, so if it's indivisible and unitary, in this way it shares in limit, for what participates unity is finite. But it is at once indivisible and of infinite potency. We know that it is of infinite potency because of Propositions 84 and 86. Proposition 47, I'm not going to jump back to that one, but it's the one that states that the self-constituted is without parts and is simple. And so because it is at once indivisible and of infinite potency, it shares in limit. We already saw that it shares in the infinite as well. Therefore, all true being is composed of limit and infinite. So now Proclus has introduced limit and infinite, but now he has to introduce limit itself and infinity itself. And that is Proposition 90. Proposition 90 reads, prior to all that is composed of limit and infinitude, there exists substantially and independently the first limit and the first infinity. For if prior to the characters of individuals there subsist these characters in themselves as universal and originative causes, belonging not to some but to all without restriction. Let me pause there. So here he's citing Proposition 23. This is the one I've gone back to a number of times in past videos. It shows that the unparticipated principle precedes the participated principle. In other words, the monad must exist prior to what participates that character immanently. I actually think, though, that looking at Proposition 21 would be more useful to us. Proposition 21 reads, every order has its beginning in a monad, and it proceeds to a manifold coordinate therewith. And the manifold in any order may be carried back to a single monad. And I'm not going to go through the whole proposition, of course, but there are a few points that I want to highlight. And I put them in yellow. For the monad has the relative status of an originative principle, and so it generates the appropriate manifold. Okay, and so that is what in 23 is called the unparticipated monad. And just one other point here is that in each order or causal chain there exists a single monad prior to the manifold, which determines for the members of the order their unique relation to one another and to the whole. It is true that among members of the same series, one is cause of another, but that which is cause of the series as a unity must be prior to them all. So going back to Proposition 90 from the start here, if prior to the characters of individuals there subsist these characters in themselves as universal and originative causes, which we just saw in Proposition 21, it's belonging not to some but to all without restriction. It gives unity to that series, as we just saw. Then before their common product there must exist the first limit and the primitively infinite. For the limit contained in the mixture has a share of infinitude, and the infinite of limit. But the first manifestation of any principle is free from alien elements, and hence the primitively infinite can have no infusion of limit, nor the first limit of infinitude. Therefore, these characters exist primitively prior to the mixture. And it may also be helpful here to remind you of Proposition 18, which reads, everything which by its existence bestows a character on others, itself primitively possesses that character which it communicates to the recipients. And so the first limit and the first infinitude each primitively possess their own proper character before passing on that character to any others in their series. Okay, here's proposition 91. It says there are both finite and infinite potencies, but all finite potency arises from infinite potency, and this latter from the first infinity. So we're getting the metaphysical order of these potencies. And it reads, for temporal potencies are finite, having lapsed from the infinitude of perpetual being. In other words, they've slipped away from the infinite and now into the realm of becoming or coming to be. But those of perpetual things are infinite, never abandoning the existence to which they belong. And so we would get a structure something like this, and we've seen this basic sort of structure before. So the monad infinity is at the head of the series. The first participants in any series will be those which are more like to it, and that would be infinite potencies. And then after those would be finite potencies. And by the way, the law of similitude, or the rule that like terms precede unlike terms, that was introduced back in propositions 28 and 29 for those of you who might want to review that. Now, you may be wondering why this series deals with potencies. Here this was actually a very short proposition, yet it leaves a lot of questions because we're talking about infinity, and then what follows it are potencies. The head of the series, though, is infinity. It's not power or potency. Well, it's important to see that for Proclus, limit and infinity cannot truly be separated. Of course, we talk about them separately for the sake of metaphysical discussions, but they are an inseparable dyad. Limit is so close to the one that, remember, even being participates it. And that was proposition 89, that all true being is composed of limit and infinitude. Limit is so close to the one, it's even more potent than being itself, which means it's more unified than being itself. And remember propositions 61 and 62, that power is commensurate with unity. So limit is sometimes called the truly one, and infinity is its infinite power. We see this description of infinity in proposition 92, this description of it being infinite power. And this is what I want to end with today. So proposition 92 reads, the whole multitude of infinite potencies is dependent upon one principle, the first infinity, which is not potency in the sense that it is participated or exists in things which are potent, but it is potency in itself, not the potency of an individual, but the cause of all that is. So by calling it the cause of all that is, Proclus has sneakily referred to infinity itself, not as something separate from limit itself, but as that dyadic principle that is the immediate cause of being. For even if primal being itself possesses potency, yet it is not simple potency, for it also possesses limit. Whereas the first potency is infinity. So there, it's very clear. It's in the italicized part, and it's very clear right here. For infinite potencies are such by participation of infinity. So that prior to all potencies, there must be simple infinity, in virtue of which being is infinite in potency, which was proposition 86. And all things have a portion of infinitude. Infinity is not the first principle, for that is the measure of all things, being the good and the one. It actually should be the one. Neither is it being, for being is infinite and not infinity. cause of all things infinite in potency, in cause of all infinitude in things, infinity falls between the first principle and being. Okay, so the good as the measure of all things was proposition 12, and equating the good in the one was proposition 13. Now notice that he puts infinity between the first principle, which would be the one and good, and being. He did not put both limit and infinity between the first principle and being, only infinity. And he can do this because infinity is dyadic. So I'm going to stop here for today, but in my next video, I'm going to make good on a promise that I had made previously. I had said that I would, in the future, talk about the concept of relative infinity, and that comes up in Proposition 93, so that'll be my next video. So I do hope you'll join me for that, and as always, please comment and like if you found this helpful. Thank you very much.